The liver does a lot more than just what we think. We eat food, that food is broken down into nutrients, those go into the bloodstream, and that blood travels to the liver, and the liver then helps break things down and then helps us synthesize those nutrients and utilize them so that our body can do things with them. And then yes, the liver absolutely does play a role in breaking down toxins as well, but it does more than just that. So what are things that are damaging the liver? Let's just jump right in and have some fun with this. Okay, the first one, high fructose corn syrup. Now, before a lot of the internet trolls start raining on my parade about this, we have to look at some brand spanking new stuff, some stuff that's so new it hasn't even reached the papers yet in terms of what's published, because this was just talked about at Endo 2022, which is the annual Endocrinology Society's meeting. Okay, and what they found is when they took a look at over 3,900 participants, they found that the more people consumed high fructose corn syrup, the higher the likelihood they would have to have a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease issue. Now, correlation does not always equal causation, but on this channel, we've speculated before, based upon different varying bodies of research in humans and in mice, that high levels of fructose, like in high fructose corn syrup, overconsumption of that can certainly lead to some forms of a fatty liver. Now, overconsumption in general can lead to a fatty liver, but high fructose corn syrup is just, it's so manufactured, it's a very unnatural thing for our body to deal with. It's hard to synthesize a bolus of fructose coming in at that heightened degree. Now, it could go even as far to say what the NIH actually quotes, okay, and I quote, "Studies suggest high fructose corn syrup may increase the risk of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease simply because too much fat ends up in the liver cells." Okay, so when we look at what the NIH says, even they make a statement on this. But let's understand the mechanism here. How is high fructose corn syrup actually potentially affecting our liver? And for that, we have to look at rodent model studies. I know they're mice, but we still have to look, right? So in this case, they gave mice either high fructose corn syrup or a control for 5 months. Okay, what they found was interesting. They found that the high fructose corn syrup group not only ended up developing a fatty liver, but they also ended up developing liver tumors as well. Now, here's what's really wild though. This could be the whole reasoning behind this. They found that high fructose corn syrup tended to break down the gut barrier, allowing for endotoxins, so basically things that are in the gut that should stay in the gut, to leak into the bloodstream. When these things leaked into the bloodstream, they would travel to the liver, and when they would travel to the liver, it would ultimately trigger an inflammatory response. So basically you would have these macrophages, this inflammation, this immune system response, and this inflammation in and of itself would actually increase the enzymes that are associated with converting fructose into fat. So let's back up for just a second. When we have this inflammation that results from things leaking out of the gut, it changes how the body takes fructose and turns it into fat, accelerating the process. So it's a double whammy. High fructose corn syrup may directly contribute to liver fat just from the overconsumption in general, but it might actually affect the gut and streamline that whole process in the first place. Okay. One of the things you want to be cognizant of is really taking care of your gut so that you can deal with toxins in your gut as well. I put a link down below for Seed, which is a very good quality, what is called a synbiotic. It is a prebiotic and a probiotic. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to solve all the problems with the liver, but I am saying if we take care of what's happening in the gut, we can really be one step ahead of a lot of this stuff potentially. So they utilize a cool technology with a capsule inside of a capsule. You can see it on the screen, it's really cool. Okay, and that link down below will get you 15% off. You just use that code Thomas15 and use that link that's down below in the description. So that is for Seed's Daily Synbiotic, which is, in my opinion, probably the best probiotic that's on the market, simply because they put their money where their mouth is, they do the research, and they have the tech behind it. So that link is down below to save 15%. So check them out. Take care of the gut, and a lot of times everything else will kind of follow. Okay, now let's move into one that you probably know a little bit more about as far as damage to the liver. That's going to be alcohol. But we need to break things down a little bit more because it's really mind-blowing when you understand how little alcohol you need to mess up the liver. Now, this study was published in the American Journal of Gastroenterology. Pretty small study, only looked at about 2.6 million people, okay? And they found that people that had the occasional drink, like maybe one drink a week or something like that, had almost no liver issues or liver damage whatsoever. But people that had one drink per night had a significant amounts of liver damage compared to the occasional drinkers. Just 1 drink a night. I know that's kind of scary, and then if you look further down the spectrum, people that had 5+ drinks per night had massive damage to the liver. Okay, now I know that not everyone is having 5 drinks per night, but I know a lot of people that have 1 drink per night, even just 1 glass of wine because it's supposed to be healthy because of the resveratrol. Okay, I think we need to rethink some things. The occasional drink, maybe not 1 per day. Anyway, let's look at the 3 different categories that kind of happen here. For one, the first thing that kind of happens, you end up with a fatty liver. Okay, this is where basically the liver is dealing so much with breaking down the alcohol and acetaldehyde from the alcohol that it really can't deal with things as well, so it stores fat easier. The next phase is sort of the alcoholic hepatitis. This is where you're starting to get more inflammation, a little bit of scarring, kind of that fibrosis beginning to happen. And then the third phase is sort of that fibrosis leading into cirrhosis. So that's kind of the stage how it can progress. So if we can nip it in the bud with the fatty liver, then we're really off to a better start. Now what ends up happening is when you consume alcohol, there is an enzyme called CYP2E1. Okay, the CYP2E1, it breaks down acetaldehyde, it breaks down the alcohol in the liver. But a byproduct of this whole process of that breakdown is a high degree of free radicals. Okay, so these free radicals then form, and then the liver has to deal with them. Well, it's hard for them to deal with that. That is a lot of toxic stress. And this ultimately leads to lipid peroxidation, where you're basically oxidizing some of the fats that are in the liver. Okay, well, this leads to another issue. Then you end up with inflammation in the liver. And when you end up with inflammation in the liver, guess what? That drives up more reactive oxygen species. Okay, so then you have even less ability to deal with this because you're overwhelmed with stress. Then, on top of that, you're also inhibiting the antioxidants within your liver. So you have things like glutathione that are in your body, inherent, naturally occurring antioxidants. But because you're dealing with the alcohol, things like glutathione have to actually deal with the alcohol, which therefore negatively impacts the glutathione transport, and that affects the entire mitochondria within the liver. So then you have reactive oxygen species that are building up and an inability to deal with the reactive oxygen species that are building up. Think about how that damages the liver. It makes perfect sense, right? Then you start to eat food, the liver can't deal with it, it stores in the liver easier. That's the problem. Here's another interesting one. Now we move into the next thing on the list, not drinking enough water. This is wild. Now I'm always on my wife's case about not drinking enough water. She does pretty good, but I'm always hounding her because I know the importance of it. Well, there's an interesting study published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition. This one took a look at 16,434 people, and they took a look at how much water they drank, and they categorized them into 3 groups: 3 or less cups per day, 4 to 7 cups of water per day, or 7+ cups of water per day. And they found a pretty clear correlation. The more water people drank, the less the likelihood of them developing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Now, to understand the mechanism here, we need to back things out. We don't fully understand what's going on here, but the researchers speculate 2 things. For one, the basic thing. When people are consuming more water, they're eating less food. The likelihood of them overdoing calories, which is really the big problem with fatty liver, the likelihood of them doing that is much less. They're just suppressing their appetite with water. So that's simple. And the other one is one that's a little more logical that you might have already thought. You're flushing things through the liver. Sounds basic, but the more that you're hydrating, you have the ability to excrete things before they possibly have to be dealt with at the liver level. Still a lot to be discovered here, but it's very, very interesting. Now we move into something that I find to be fascinating. It has nothing to do with what we're consuming and everything to do with our overall lifestyle. Stress might be one of the biggest, if not the biggest driver for liver damage outside of alcohol. There's a study published in the journal Scientific Reports that took a look at over 171,000 people. Huge study, okay? And they took a look at people's stress levels for like 8 or 9 years. They found that the highest levels of stress were associated with a 17% increase in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And it was even more pronounced in men. So men might fall victim to the symptoms of stress even more so than women. So now we have to ask the question, well, okay, this is a scientific channel. What's potentially happening here? Well, what's interesting is when we end up in that fight or flight response, when we're stressed out, we have blood flow that diverts to the peripheral, right? It goes to our muscles, it goes to our limbs so we can exercise that fight or flight. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't happen in the liver. You actually starve the liver. So therefore, the liver actually becomes hypoxic. So you're putting your liver in an oxygen-starved state, which isn't good for an organ. This decrease in oxygen leads to an increase in oxidative stress at the mitochondrial level. Because the mitochondria in the liver is starving for fuel, it starts kind of self-destructing and creating this reactive oxygen species. Well, then you end up with more inflammation as a result of that. Well, guess what? We end up down that spiral again. More inflammation leads to more reactive oxygen species. And think about something here for a second. You have a bunch of reactive oxygen species because you're stressed. What do a lot of people do when they're stressed? They start drinking, right? So then you're inhibiting the glutathione from doing its job properly. So man, drinking plus stress, oh my gosh, like the two worst possible things you could do. Eventually those cells get weak and they die, okay? So they become what are called necrotic cells. Necrotic cells leak damaged DNA. They leak what are called damage-associated molecular patterns. They leak these damaged particles. And these damaged particles cause an inflammatory response, and they cause what are called the Kupffer cells, which are specific liver cells, to secrete interleukin-1 beta, which is an inflammatory cytokine that causes all kinds of issues. So our liver can be an epicenter for A, how we feel just throughout our entirety, but B, the stress and what we're inflicting upon our liver could be the exact reason why we have less ability to deal with nutrients and store more at the liver level. Lastly, with this, the cortisol might actually have a backward spike with the liver. So normally when we're stressed out, cortisol will actually suppress an inflammatory response. It's like if you take hydrocortisone or corticosteroid, it's actually suppressing cortisol. But with liver, it's different. Okay, a cortisol spike actually spikes inflammation at the liver level to try to deal with an issue at the liver quickly. So it spikes inflammation to the liver. So then we can kind of add this on to the mix. Now, another thing we have to think about is the sedentary lifestyle. Okay, sedentary lifestyle is a huge contributor. And with this, we just have correlational data. We don't really understand what's going on. There's a study published in the BMJ Open Journal that looked at over 2,000 people. It took a look at people that sat for more than 7 hours per day. It found the longer that people sat over 7 hours, there was a 9% increase in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So 7 hours was a 9% increase, and then above that, it just continued to increase. You may not think you're sitting for 7 hours per day, but try actually paying attention to it. You work an office job, even if you're getting up a little bit, you're probably sitting for more than 7 hours per day. It's pretty gnarly. Now, the last thing I need to mention, which is a very important piece, if you are already somewhat insulin resistant or pre-diabetic or anything like that, unfortunately, you do need to pay attention to saturated fat. I know this is a lower carb channel, generally speaking, and I understand the whole reasoning behind adding saturated fat into the diet, but saturated fats are harder to break down. Okay, and what ends up happening is the liver has an inability to deal with a surplus of fats coming in. And instead of being able to package them into the triglyceride form that it needs to package them into, it ends up leaving them halfway broken down into what are called, or built, I should say, into what is called a diglycerol. So diglycerols form within the liver, still a fat that forms in the liver. And for that matter of fact, if you actually look at a liver, you could look at the level of diglycerol in a liver, and that is a strong indicator if someone is insulin resistant. So you do have to be careful with saturated fat intake because it absolutely positively can contribute to a fatty liver. And if you look at the data, saturated fat is just as bad as high fructose corn syrup in a lot of ways as contributing to a fatty liver. So everything in moderation. Now with that, I recommend having usually 10 or 20% of your total fat calories coming from saturated fat, the rest from mono and polyunsaturated fats because they're easier to sort of dismantle and allow the body to use. So just to break it all down, I hope that this was able to help you out. Cut out the high fructose corn syrup, chill out on the saturated fat, chill out on the alcohol, try to live a little bit more of a stress-free life, and if you're sedentary a lot, try to get up and move as much as you possibly can. I'll see you tomorrow.